Okay, hello everyone, and thank you so much to Melissa Dale and Cynthia Schultes and all of the staff at USF Center for Asia Pacific Studies. It's a great honor to be able to speak to all of you, and I wish that I could see all of you in person, of course, but we'll have some engagement at the end, so I'm looking forward to having more of a chat with each of you. So today it's a great honor to speak about this quite painful episode in Ainu present, not Ainu past. This is an ongoing struggle for the Ainu community. And I want to be completely transparent, just making sure that, okay. I want to be completely transparent and just share with you that this is actually the first time I've presented any of this material especially about the ancestral repatriation and homecoming that you see here pictured on the screen. And I'll say a little bit more about that as we move through the presentation. But I want to mention, first of all, that I am speaking to you from Santa Barbara, from the indigenous homeland of the Chumash community. And I want to acknowledge that for those of you, at least in San Francisco, USF is on the indigenous land of the Ohlone people. I understand that there are many different lineages of Ohlone, and the history of San Francisco is quite complicated, but I want to acknowledge the presence, not just historical, but the ongoing continued presence of indigenous knowledge keepers and culture bearers in that land there in San Francisco and right here, the Chumash community, where I've been a guest living on their land for many, many years. And I mention that because it's important to remember this is not simply a question of acknowledging the land, but it also means we need to acknowledge the work that needs to be done. And I want to thank my indigenous Ainu family in Urakawa, which is where this picture was taken, because they've taught me about the process of what it means to engage in a responsible, reciprocal relationship with the ancestors and the sort of the keepers of the land in that place. And one more point, I just want to note that I usually don't put that I'm affiliated with the anthropology department on my title slide, but I think it's important to mention today because as you'll see from today's presentation, anthropologists bear a very, very heavy burden of responsibility for the history and the sort of ongoing trauma that comes from this episode, this ongoing episode in the Ainu community. Okay, so I want to start out by celebrating that Ainu are an indigenous, thriving, vital, diverse, extremely creative, and fantastic community that is doing all sorts of work to explore the full range of what it means to live in the present moment. I'm going to talk about some very painful aspects of that history, but I want to start out with a note of celebration and just show you some really inspiring images of what I think of as really sort of some of the trends in terms of Ainu artistic production and Ainu sort of creative expression and refusal to sort of be solidified in a kind of forever past, forever in this kind of unchanging moment, right? The sort of moment when Hokkaido became part of Japan, for example, in 1869 or before that time. So I start out with these two images, one of Sakai Mina on the left, who is part of the group Ainu Rebels, and then the vocal group Mareoreu here with Kano Oki, who's a tonkori, a roots musician. He's revived the Sahalin Ainu instrument, the tonkori. But I also want to note that being an indigenous modern is complex. It's multifaceted. And I realize that not all of us are familiar with what I mean when I talk about settler colonialism. And so I want to first sort of orient everyone by explaining, sort of break that down a little bit. So I want to walk you through, firstly, how Ainu have been indigenized and why Hokkaido today is a settler colonial terrain. And then finally explore how Japan's settler occupation of Ainu land and lifeways still continues in the present. And as I note here, today, being Indigenous, it is a celebration of relationship with the land and one's ancestors, but it also means reckoning with a very painful settler colonial past. And that may include a range of different types of violence, everything from microaggression to state-sanctioned racism, to dealing with environmental justice issues, such as having one's land flooded with environmental toxins, to full-scale genocide. It's really a broad range of experiences that encapsulates the sort of settler colonial present for Indigenous peoples. And I want to introduce here 3 key points that I hope will become clearer through today's talk. Number 1 is that Ainu are Indigenous peoples, and part of this removal of their ancestors has been a way that their sort of indigenization, their racialization was consolidated for Japan. Secondly, that Hokkaido is a settler colonial terrain, as I've just presented. And thirdly, that the settler occupation of Ainu lands still continues in the present. So first of all, to get everyone oriented, I want us to understand that Ainu ancestral territories have never been confined exclusively to the borders of the Japanese nation. They've always been a sort of border crossing community. The green area refers to Ainu ancestral territories. And from the year 700, Ainu lived as far south as just north of Tokyo, all the way up to the southern half of Sakhalin Island, as well as the southern part of Kamchatka. Here in Russia and also the Kuril Islands. And so as you can see, like many indigenous communities, including the Kumeyaay people here in California, who are bifurcated by the US-Mexico border, Ainu also are split through the Japan-Russian border. And in recent years, actually, there's been a group of Ainu in Sakhalin who've become more and more active. And so it's very exciting to sort of think about some potential future collaborations between Ainu in Japan and Ainu in Russia. And then the sort of inset, the larger map gives you an idea of where the Ainu population today is broadly concentrated in Hokkaido. Okay. So academic colonialism. Indigenous scholars often say that research is one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. And this is a comment, an argument that's made by Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who is a Maori scholar from Aotearoa. And she is the author of an amazing book called Decolonizing Methodologies, which I'm happy to introduce at the end. But she reminds us that research is interpenetrated with privileges, practices, and ideas that were part and parcel of imperial expansionism and colonization and have been institutionalized in academic disciplines. And so we have to remember that when we function within the university, within the institution, we operate with a sort of power which allows us access to life worlds of communities who often don't have control over the sort of borders or the boundaries of those life worlds. This is something that we need to keep in mind. And pictured here is Bafunke, whose Japanese name is Kimura Aikichi. He is a Karafto Ainu, whose history is very, very important for all of us to understand with this broader question of Ainu ancestors being removed from their resting places. And I want to start us out with a really important perspective that I think very few of us have had the opportunity to imagine. And this is from the words of Dobashi Yoshimi, who has written the story about Penryuk. She says, that time was autumn of 1933. A strange noise awoke me from my 30-year slumber. Was it the soft rustling of the wind? No. Was it the chirping of a small bird's voice and the rubbing of tree branches? No. No. Rather, the crisp sound of metal aiming at me. And then the entire earth heaved. Earthquake, I thought, remembering the feeling. I called on my senses, but I couldn't understand. And then as I lay on the earth, I felt my flesh fall away and my body lighten. I wondered, could this be the rites of passage to enter the land of the dead? So these are the words of Penryuk, who is the ancestor of Dobashi Yoshimi. And when she first learned in 2016 by searching on the internet that her ancestor, sometimes called Chief Penryuk, is his remains are held in the ossuary at Hokkaido University. She was absolutely consumed by pain and grieving and a great sadness. And the way that she tried to deal with that was by writing a long form poem, trying to understand what possibly could have been experienced by her ancestor Penryuk. And this is a very small sample from that long verse poem. And I want to start out with this because it's really important that we try to put ourselves in the position, even if the Ainu culture, Ainu lands seems very foreign to us, we need to remember what it might feel like if this were our ancestor, if this were our, grandparents that we had very fond memories of. What would it feel like if they had gone through this experience? So some historical context. Between 1865 and 1972, more than 2,000 Ainu ancestors were removed from grave sites across Hokkaido. We estimate that there are more than 1,600 identifiable and something like 515 unidentifiable remains. And I just want to note that this number, there are many different reports, and it's a bit of a fluid number, but this is what we understand at the moment. And I want to say thank you so much to Michael Rollinghoff, who's here today, for all of his help in sort of helping me track down what the latest information is on these figures. So we need to understand that that the discipline of anthropology in Europe, and then later when it was developed in Japan, it originated in and developed through practices of archaeology and physical anthropology that were focused explicitly on racial origins and on the ethnogenesis of the Japanese. And one way to sort of sort that out was to conduct research on Ainu bone structure and Ainu bodies in order to establish, sort of gather more data sets and gain clarity about the ethnogenesis of the broader Japanese and the peopling of the Japanese archipelago. And so in order to do this, there were some very questionable and very problematic practices that took place in order to get access to Ainu ancestors. So together with their grave goods and heirloom items, Ainu ancestors were removed from their grave sites. When local Ainu communities attempted to stop or block the digging up of ancestral grave sites, the police were called in. I heard stories from several Ainu elders. They heard from their own elders or heard firsthand about how when their grandparents went to try and stop the digging up of these grave sites, their ancestors were actually their grandparents rather, were actually physically restrained, yanked up off of the grave sites, and often held by the police or kept out of the area. And the archaeologists and the scholars, the anthropologists, were allowed to continue their work because these scholars were representatives of imperial universities, and they were given sort of carte blanche. They engaged in this work with total impunity. And I just realized I forgot to put a caption on the photos, but the upper caption is actually from a team that went to the northernmost tip of the Japanese Empire, which was in Sakhalin. And this is part of their uh, um, archaeological trip, their expedition to Sakhalin to remove, essentially to visit Ainu grave sites and collect Ainu remains from Sakhalin Island. And this photo is from the 1930s. And then the bottom photo is actually the Ainu, the ossuary, or the charnel house as it's sometimes called, where Ainu ancestors were held at Hokkaido until 2020, when the National Ainu Museum was built in Shirawai. Okay. So just to give you an idea of how widespread this practice was, this practice, the system of collecting and gathering and essentially invading and stealing Ainu from Ainu grave sites extends across the entire nation of Japan. 12 universities have collections of Ainu ancestors. And the largest one is Hokkaido University in the north there. But there's, again, more than 2,000 remains that were stolen from grave sites, but also removed from prisons and hospitals. And these were permitted, again, during that period, primarily in the early 20th century for the prison and hospital examples. The other point is that this is not simply a domestic issue. This is actually an international problem, because not included in this map, although we do have some Russian islands over here to the in the northeastern quadrant. There are also collections of Ainu ancestors in the United Kingdom, in the US, also Australia, Germany, and Russia. And Germany has just repatriated theirs as of a couple of years ago. And we'll see an image of that in a moment. But the other point here is that researchers made the argument, especially Mr. Kodama, who was in charge of the vast majority of many of these excavations. Kodama argued that the Ainu grave sites were abandoned, and essentially that no one was tending to the graves, and there was no sort of ongoing relationship between Ainu and the grave sites. And so therefore it was okay to just go in and start conducting, removing the ancestors. And this is extremely problematic, but it also is based on a misunderstanding. That is this assumption that, sorry, I'll talk about Kodama at the end. I see something in the chat, but this is based on an assumption that that Ainu engage in the same type of memorial practices with their ancestors as ethnic Japanese do. And many of you may be familiar that for the majority of Japanese people who, those of whom practice Buddhism, there are several annual ceremonies and rituals to honor those who are deceased. Sometimes they're located in the gravesite, sometimes at the Buddhist altar in one's home, sometimes at the local temple. But the point is that for the ethnic Japanese community, there are regular annual occasions wherein the ancestors are honored and memorialized and given offerings. In the Ainu case, there is one gigantic, massive celebration of life that extends for many, many days. And then when that ancestor has been sort of officially sent off to the land of the Kamui, Kamui being the Ainu word for spirit being, or for those who have passed and those who actually belong to the superhuman world. At that point, Ainu bid farewell, and there is no sort of ongoing engagement with burial sites. And so this is the fundamental misunderstanding upon which Professor Kodama, Professor Kokane, and other early researchers sort of based their argument that these grave sites were abandoned. Okay, so I want to sort of break down why settler colonialism, why and how settler colonialism makes sense in the case of Japan. So there are two sort of major kind of schools of thought on settler colonialism. But the really important point here is that I want to sort of distinguish it from your sort of garden variety of colonialism. Sort of average run-of-the-mill colonialism, as it were, is focused on extracting resources from the colonial land and sending them back to the metropole, or otherwise some sort of temporary arrangement. It's very invasive, it's very violent, but it is not ongoing, it's not permanent. The difference with settler colonialism is that we're bringing in settler bodies who occupy the land, who take over the land and remove, erase, or force the indigenous community to leave, okay? So the idea here is that settler colonialism, its agenda is to seize new lands and resources to render them productive, often through slave labor. And this necessitates that you must erase or remove any prior residents, whether they are there at that moment or not. They must be removed from the land. Secondly, it requires, it often means that if you don't remove the indigenous residents, one other option is to essentially conscript them as corvée laborers, essentially slave laborers. And you had kind of both of these two patterns happening in the case of Hokkaido with the contract fishery system, which is in operation throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. You had Ainu being forced to leave their home communities and sent off to work in the fisheries, basically as slave labor. It was very, very sort of extreme, brutal kinds of conditions. So you have these two kinds of patterns, and I think we can argue that both of them are happening in the case of Hokkaido. The other thing that's really important to understand is that settler colonialism is a structure, it's not an event. It's not a one-time thing that happened and was ended. It did not end in 1945 when Japan was stripped of its sort of quote unquote external colonies, when Japan gave up its colonial occupied lands in the Asia Pacific. Instead, settler colonialism in the case of Japan, it continues on into the present. And for the Ainu community, as well as the Okinawan community, they are living with a settler society and a settler state occupier in the present moment. So I think it's important for us to understand that even the process of Ainu attempting to get restorative justice by having their ancestral remains repatriated is happening within this broader legal framework of a settler state. So in essence, this means it's not really in Japan's interest to repatriate the ancestors. So there's a lot of pushing and a lot of work that Ainu have had to do in order to force, to really compel Japan to sort of see the merit for working towards a process of reconciliation by returning their ancestors. So another question we might add, why do we need to sort of focus on this brutal and painful, difficult history? And I would argue that by learning and by thinking really carefully about this process of essential grave robbing throughout, over a century-long period, in Japan and Hokkaido's history, we can learn about two things. One is that this issue is essentially about sovereignty, a question of sovereignty, and secondly, that it's also about cultural difference. And when I say sovereignty, I'm not talking about sovereignty in the Westphalian sense of borders and sort of political official state relations between one nation state and another nation state. I'm more interested in the question of sovereignty in the sense of a particular set of relationships with the land, with the water, and with the ancestors in that place. It's about a reciprocal set of relationships that enable a co-flourishing between human and more than human, also known as superhuman, beings in the land. Okay, so it's much more than simply sort of this notion of control or political control over the land. It's really about a kind of responsibility and accountability to the land where one lives. Also recognition that the land is connected to one's survival, right? That we are impacted very directly. We might even think about this as sort of the way that we exchange oxygen and molecules with the soil and with the air and the water in the places where we live. And so, and the other piece is about cultural difference, sometimes sort of code word for racial difference, is a way that it has been defined by anthropologists in the past. But it's important to understand that the theft of Ainu remains from grave sites was a critical piece needed by Japanese anthropology to set Ainu apart as a racially distinct and a culturally distinct population. They are othered. They are not us. They are not Japanese. And that was essential, argued to be essential, that is, for that project. And this process of establishing cultural and racial distinction or difference was also a key piece that Japan used to claim a kind of political sovereignty and unilaterally annex Ezo, Japan's sort of pre-colonial name for the land that becomes Hokkaido is Ezo. Later in 1869, it is renamed as Hokkaido and it becomes part of Japan, the nation state. And here when I talk about sovereignty, I'm speaking of Japan, the nation state, and its political control and political sovereignty over Hokkaido, bringing it into this broader project of the nation state. So, and the other piece that I want to sort of emphasize here is that like the Black Lives Matter movement, Ainu have had this brand new Ainu law passed in 2019, which sort of formalizes Ainu as Japan's indigenous peoples. There was an earlier policy, an earlier sort of official Japanese statement and resolution passed in 2008, which also recognized Ainu as indigenous. But unfortunately, this did not end racism, discrimination, or stigmatization of the Ainu community. Again, they are still very much fighting for their dignity and fighting to be sort of honored and respected structurally within Japanese society. And so finally, I would argue that it's really not possible for us to sort of move closer to any form of historical justice or reconciliation until we sort of really grapple with the history that has long been kind of submerged. And in fact, I think thinking really critically about what does the settler colonial process mean in the case of Japan, and then how did that process sort of enable a very sort of simple a sort of normalization of the unjust removal of Ainu remains from grave sites. That, that structure is sort of part and parcel of enabling that process to happen. So sovereignty and dehumanization. The other thing I want to sort of argue as an extension of this is that this denial of sovereignty, this denial of relations with the land and the ancestors, and the imprinting of racial difference has meant an ongoing process of dehumanization that continues for Ainu and other colonized peoples even after death. They are not able to sort of rest and enjoy kind of a peaceful sort of afterlife because these structures continue to operate, continue to sort of instantiate a dehumanization. So, and we can see this through the ways that the dehumanization has been operationalized. Not only are remains and heirloom items that are buried with the ancestors removed, then they are subjected to invasive procedures such as genetic testing. They are often, there are many cases of sort of blood testing, sampling of earwax, other forms of sort of bodily research, biological research that was carried out without the permission. That one of the main representatives of the Kotan no Kai, I'll speak about in a moment, often tells a story about how he remembers having people come into his school, take him out of school and sort of grab his skin and extract various kinds of bodily samples from him without ever explaining why they were doing this or asking for his permission. And then returning to the ancestral remains, these are then used to sort of further strengthen these theories of racial inferiority, of Ainu otherness. And then historically, they were used to dispossess Ainu of land, livelihood, and certainly of dignity. So I think it's really important at this juncture. I just want to bring up one piece about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights. Ainu do have legal protection for Indigenous rights. But one of the things that Ainu requests is that they want to be treated with dignity as other, as everyone else in Japan. But at the same time, they're asking for sort of recognition as different, different from the settler state, because of their historical relationship with the land and with their ancestors, and the important reciprocal work that they want to be able to continue. Okay, so what is at stake? Sovereignty and connection to the land, control over Ainu indigenous memory, this ongoing suffering through an intergenerational trauma, which continues to be passed from one generation to the next, as long as remains are not returned to communities. Obviously, a huge question of cultural sovereignty and ultimately the capacity to thrive and be recognized as being on the same footing with and sort of eligible for the same types of sort of basic human rights as fellow Japanese citizens. So I want to briefly talk about some of the steps that lead us up to the present. Before when Ainu first learned that their ancestors were being stored, held at the Hokkaido University, they demanded, first of all, that all of the remains be shifted out of the researchers' labs where they were held in a very kind of disheveled, sort of disrespectful fashion, just kind of strewn about and not organized properly. So first they lobbied and demanded that Hokkaido University construct this charnel house. And then every August, there is an ancestral memorial ceremony that is held to honor Ainu ancestors who are held here at Hokkaido University. And then, so the first step was at least gaining the permission and the support for being allowed to honor Ainu ancestors on the campus of Hokkaido University. And it's important to understand that Hokkaido University is an imperial university. There are multiple imperial universities across the Japanese archipelago, but because of this status, it has a particular relationship to the central government. And particular kinds of sort of access and authority that flow from that, that many researchers like Professor Kodama and Professor Kokane were able to enjoy in conducting their research on Ainu remains. The second piece of the process of sort of the movement to get remains repatriated is a series of university of eco tours that were held on the campus of Hokkaido University from 2007 until I'm not sure how long these continued, but I know they were still being held in 2014. But on the left-hand side, you see a campus map. And I love this image because it shows you very clearly the current map of the university overlain with a sort of an Ainu memory map, which documents the fact that Hokkaido University actually sits literally on the exact site of a historical Ainu village. And so you can see the waterway that is threaded across the campus. All of that water has been rerouted, sort of re-engineered, but all of the sort of tools, archaeological sort of, excuse me, all of the archaeological sites that were excavated here showed the different kinds of tools that were used for fishing, because you had salmon actually spawning in this river that now flows through the campus of Hokkaido University, a fact that I would argue many students and even faculty are completely unaware of. And then the right-hand side, this is Mr. Ogawa Ryukichi, and he is actually inside the Charnel House. It's only open once a year, or was only open once a year during this ceremony held in August. And here he is telling the history of the grave robbing history and how all of these ancestors ended up being held in this ossuary on the campus of Hokkaido University. And then finally, in 2012, the activists essentially lost their patience. There's a lot more I could go into in terms of details for how we sort of got to this point, but they decided to sue the university. They took their battle to the courts, and this is an image of some of the plaintiffs, including Mr. Ogawa, standing outside the Hokkaido Medical School campus with the banner reading, we demand that Hokkaido University return our ancestors remain, our ancestral remains to us. And the court battle continued until 2016, when there was a settlement. And most incredibly, the Kotan no Kai was the group that was formed from some of the plaintiffs. They successfully won the restitution of their ancestors. And so now I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about how that process happened. So this is in 2016, when the ancestors were actually brought home and reburied. This is to my knowledge, this is the first reburial ceremony that has been held in Hokkaido. And so this was a monumental event. As you can imagine, this was historically unprecedented. No one had ever sort of attempted to try and heal the suffering, not only their own trauma, but the suffering and pain of their ancestors who had been removed from their resting place and stored in this stored in a university laboratory, subjected to invasive procedures and subjected to all sorts of traumatic experiences. And so this was really a monumental task to try to figure out, how can we do this in a way that will bring peace, finally bring peace, and allow us to express our great respect and our huge sense of apology and humility to our ancestors who have suffered so much. So that was a real challenge for this community. So I want to say a little bit about the process. So I'm sorry, I'm going to just move to explain the two sort of sets of logics that were informing some of these strategies to have the ancestors repatriated. And as I mentioned in my abstract, we have both legal modernity and sort of what I'm calling a biogenetic modernity. And I think it's important to understand that the sort of legal argument has carried the most sort of emphasis and really had the most kind of support from the Ainu community. The group of Ainu that are sort of in support of this kind of use of DNA or genetic testing in some way either repatriate ancestors or in fact continue research on ancestors, that group is quite small. It's really more of a minority in my understanding. But so let me speak a little bit about legal modernity. The way I understand this is really through taking the lawsuits to the courts, as with the battle to return Ainu ancestors from Hokkaido University, the use of Japanese civil law, and then putting a lot of pressure on the universities to return Ainu remains by forcing them to recognize that communities, not just individual lineal descendants, but actual entire communities have a particular relationship with the Ainu ancestors that are being held by these universities. And then on the other hand, genetic testing, this biogenetic modernity argument. So the idea, there was a proposal by a government panel that they could apply genetic testing as one strategy to try and sort of piece together some of the unidentified remains to try to figure out which communities they should be returned to. But for a number of reasons, this was deemed to be not an effective way to handle the situation. And of course, many felt that it was extremely invasive and would just further sort of antagonize and exacerbate the suffering of ancestors. So the Ainu Association is somewhat in the minority here, but they have argued that actually focusing on the DNA will actually help prove that Ainu are an ethnically distinct community and therefore strengthen their claims of indigenous rights. And so I'll show you a little bit more about that in a moment. But just very briefly, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples very clearly outlines Ainu, very clearly outlines indigenous communities' rights to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and the sovereignty that they enjoy, the fact that they should have informed consent, and that no state, private, or government academic institution has the right to unilaterally remove or otherwise sort of handle Ainu ancestors without their permission. And this permission was not part of the process when the ancestors were removed in the first place. And finally, so there's Article 11, 13, and 15. And 15 very clearly spells out that Ainu peoples have the right to dignity and diversity of their cultures. And so part of that is the right, of course, to determine how you will honor those among your community who pass away in your own sort of culturally determined, according to your own sort of practice. So I want to explain in as sort of simplified this as much as I possibly can. It gets very complicated very quickly, all of the sort of legal mumbo jumbo, but I think it's really important to understand that the pathway to, in order to get ancestors repatriated, involved really pushing the courts essentially to de facto recognize Ainu collective rights. And while the courts did not recognize that sort of in the legal ruling, in the settlement ruling actually, the way that the Japanese government ministries that have handled the repatriation process, those entities, the ministries, have in fact kind of shifted to a position where they're willing to recognize that entire communities may enjoy essentially worship successor rights, that even if they are not the direct lineal descendants, even if they cannot prove the presence of their name, for example, on the koseki, on the family registry, they can, as by having a group, a community represented from a particular village or region in Hokkaido, they're able to sort of claim a relationship with those remains and sort of give their commitment that they will continue to honor and worship and care for the remains in a culturally appropriate manner befitting the way their ancestors would have desired. And so this worship successor right has sort of de facto translated into maintainers of the remains kind of argument. And today, there is a process wherein this Kotan no Kai, as they've called themselves, this group is supporting individual communities to apply for the repatriation of their ancestors through this argument that they belong to a broader community and the community agrees to honor their ancestors' remains in this way. So this is from the when the German government repatriated ancestors' Ainu remains from Berlin in 2017. And then on the right-hand side, we have formerly known as Urakawa Ainu Association has now sort of transformed its identity to actually a kind of a nation, an indigenous nation known as the Rapport Ainu Nation, which is their traditional name for the traditional Ainu name for place name for their community. And they have had tremendous success in getting their ancestors repatriated from Hokkaido University, Sapporo Medical University, also the University of Tokyo. So this is quite phenomenal, the way that they've been able to bring their ancestors home. I want to mention that unfortunately, this is the sort of official website, the portal through the Ministry of Education, which was set up to sort of set out the application process to begin getting one's ancestors returned to one's community. But that office closed as of 2019 as the government prepared for relocation of all Ainu remains to the National Ainu Museum. So the website literally says our office is now closed. Obviously it says a lot more than that, but the bureaucratic sort of complexity of this process is really quite mind-boggling. And that in itself, I argue, represents a sort of another layer of violence, which Ainu are now having to negotiate in order to get some semblance of kind of reconciliation through having their ancestors repatriated. And this is Mr. Kodama, Professor Kodama, and I apologize. I realize that this image is very disturbing, but I think it's important to recognize that for many physical anthropologists and archaeologists, being able to have sort of your own personal collection of Ainu remains was seen as having kind of a national treasure. They were highly prized. And many of these these scholars built special display rooms, almost a kind of a private museum. And in this case, Hokkaido University, there were many of these display rooms constructed for the visit of the emperor, the Japanese emperor. And so, if this is not kind of a demonstration of the settler colonial project sort of in action, I can't imagine what else it might be. It's really, really disturbing to sort of see this treatment of Ainu ancestors, but they were seen again as sort of a national possession by these researchers. So I'm not going to go into too much of the detail with the biogenetic argument. We can go over this in the Q&A period if people want to hear about it. But I do want to mention one really important point, actually two. One is that drawing from the really important work of Kimberly Tallbear, hitching the entire argument about Ainu indigeneity to sort of the magic of a genetic process is really problematic, because genetic markers, according to Tallbear's argument, they are not going to be adequate for sort of demarcating ethnicity as sort of ethnic identity markers that can serve as kind of boundaries, which are irrefutable. And this is because political and cultural categories are messy. Ethnic identity, as experienced and sort of practiced and embraced by the Ainu community today, does not match clearly onto either blood or genetic criteria. It also doesn't match with political nationhood. And so this is one reason that a sort of genetic argument is problematic. The second reason is that Ainu women have long been subjected to sort of a sexual colonization. They were subject to really horrific sexual assault. They were forced to marry ethnic Japanese settlers. This continued throughout the latter portion of the contract fisheries period. And there are many folks that have documented this history. And so if you're sort of assuming there's some kind of Ainu kind of ethnic purity, as it were, historically, this kind of logic also is really troubling and really problematic. And so there are many, many problems with this idea that somehow we're going to establish these clear markers and boundaries around indigeneity through a kind of genetic argument. And then one piece I want to, I want to mention, so the Ainu Association is actually arguing in the following way. They have argued, presented to a government panel that research on Ainu human remains is significant because we can learn the origin and the history of the Ainu from such research, and therein we'll be able to establish the firm base of the distinct ethnic identity of the Ainu. It is important that Ainu people themselves benefit from this research. And it is this argument which is the basis of the decision to move all of the Ainu, went too far, Ainu ancestors who were not repatriated to communities during that very brief window between roughly 2016 and 2019 have now, from across the entire country, from all of those 12 academic institutions, all the Ainu ancestors have now been shifted to the National Ainu Museum, also known as Upapoi, which just opened in 2020. And my understanding is that Upapoi has not necessarily closed the door. They're still open to repatriating ancestors, but it's not entirely clear how that process is going to work. Certainly the coronavirus has sort of made things even more complicated. But the sort of bigger question is, what does it mean for the Ainu community if they've now essentially really streamlined the process of access to Ainu ancestors, in the sense that all of the ancestors are now under one roof, making them very accessible. And in fact, in the government panel that was discussing the working group, actually, that was planning the National Ainu Museum, they described this memorial hall as, quote, a rare example in the world where memorialization of the dead, research with human remains, and research that benefits Indigenous peoples would be taking place simultaneously. And so that is kind of their argument for why they think it's important that research be allowed to continue on Ainu ancestors who are now being stored at the Upapoi museum here. And this is in Shiraoi in Hokkaido. So I'm going to leave it there. I have several slides which sort of document the process on the actual repatriation and reburial ceremony that was held in July 2016 in Urakawa. I was very fortunate to be able to attend that. And so if that comes up in the Q&A, I'm happy to share that with folks. But I know that folks have a lot of interesting questions and discussion. So I want to now close and open